When Octopath Traveler 1 was announced, and then released on the Nintendo Switch in 2018, it brought with it a whole new aesthetic interwoven with classic turn-based gameplay. Seeing a beautiful 2D world with such fantastic pixel art, sprites, environments for a new generation was something that helped to bring the past to the present for an old-school JRPG lover like myself. Now, I love the characters, gameplay, story, and especially the music of this original title. And since its release, Square Enix and Team Asano have released other games in this HD 2D type style. This includes the great Triangle strategy and the absolutely fantastic remake Live Alive, and I'll include a link in the description below to my review of the latter. There's also Dragon Quest III Remake to be done in the HD 2D style as well. Now, the year is 2023, both the Switch and this style are over 5 years old. Was Team Asano able to create such a quality product that was the first Octopath Traveler with this sequel? Short answer, yes, and then some. Graphically, we're looking at the same style that the first entry had, though without some of the odd occlusions that Octopath Traveler 1 had, as well as many of the lighting issues being corrected too. Aesthetically, the world is not based in a medieval fantasy world like standard JRPG fare in the first entry. Instead, the sequel is set in a world very similar to ours, though in like the 19th century. This is up to and including aspects like the Industrial Revolution, the Wild West, a Japan-like country with its own civil war, a Catholic Church-like religion and waning power, and more. Major credit should be given to the dev team, Team Asano, for interweaving such a classic style of gameplay and great story in this type of world. During my experience with the overall game, I did have a few odd issues that occurred, though I'm going to preface this with the fact that I played Octopath Traveler 2 on the Nintendo Switch. Now maybe the PS4, PS5 version, or the Steam PC one would work better. There wasn't a lot of slowdown on my gameplay, though there were some parts where there were delays, such as going in and out of buildings and towns, maybe like half a second or so. The biggest issue I had was during the last boss of the game, which did see a lot of slowdown due to what was going on there. More on this fight later, and I'll make sure to abstain from spoilers. In fact, when I actually beat the game, it caused the game itself to crash during the epilogue. Thankfully, the game allows saving after beating the last boss, so I didn't technically lose any of my progress after that last boss gauntlet. I did have clipping issues a couple times during world exploration, where characters would walk past a static point in the map that tells the game to load the next section. There were also some odd sound issues that I could only describe as issues with the sound quality of the voices for the characters themselves. Now, this didn't really impact the 8 main characters. It was more prevalent in other characters in the story and NPCs that had audible lines. Now, a lot of these voices sounded very quiet, even with the vocals volume being higher than all the other volume settings for me. Maybe the voices were recorded or inputted into the game in a lower quality to save space, or maybe these voice recordings were done at various voice actors' home studios as opposed to the actual company studios due to COVID-19. The actual voice acting itself is absolutely fantastic, with the best obviously being the primary 8 characters. I especially found Alejandro Saab's Oswald and Erica Mendez's Throne putting in amazing performances for their respective characters. The sound effects themselves were fantastic and carried the appropriate weights for attacks upon enemies, getting attacked by them, and others as well. But it really is the musical soundtrack that is the star of the game. Yasunori Nishiki returns from the first entry to compose this sequel, with music every bit as good as the first entry. Now, this first entry was one of the best soundtracks for its year of release in 2018, rivaling that year's God of War, Smash Bros. Ultimate, and even Tetris Effect. It's possible that Octopath Traveler 2 is going to be the best soundtrack for 2023. At the time of the release of this video, though, I won't have played Zelda Tears of the Kingdom and Final Fantasy 16 yet, so I honestly can't say if it'll beat those. At a more granular level, each character's musical themes deftly matched their personalities and stories, and even melded to the story itself as it went along, hitting various bumps in the road that came their way. The battle themes themselves are also amazing, melding a couple leitmotifs from the first entry into each of these, from the simple battle themes up to and including fierce battle themes or the last bosses for each respective story. And as I mentioned earlier, Octopath Traveler 2 has pretty much the same gameplay loop as the first entry. In town areas, players can buy items and equipment, all of this much like an old school JRPG. As the player explores non-town areas, they'll get approached by enemies via invisible random encounters. These encounters initiate turn-based battles akin to how the Bravely Default games work, especially the second entry. Each character can select a command such as attack, defend, items, or special commands specific to their individual character. Each individual character usually has 2 of these special commands. There's also an additional command set depending on the second job they have for their assigned characters. And these jobs can be earned in towns and match the 8 main characters' jobs, though there are also 4 secret additional jobs. So for example, Throne is a thief, but you can also have her assigned a second job of warrior, and warrior is another one of the traveler's main job, Hikari. During battles, characters can use BP or battle points to increase the power or effect of their attacks, up to 4, and these BP can be saved up to 5 at a time. 1 BP is gained per turn, provided the player doesn't have a character use any of that character's available BP. Each enemy has a series of weak points via weapons or elements that, if hit with a number of times, breaks enemies or staggers them, allowing a free turn to attack said enemy without getting attacked back. In the beginning of the game, the player selects one of 8 travelers and learns of their story in their first chapter. From there, the character travels to other locations to recruit the other 7 individuals, learning of their stories as they progress as well. These 8 characters work together to help each individual overcome their own story's challenges in battles only. Stories occur between individual characters and their respective NPCs, and each chapter usually ends with a boss fight. Some chapters may have 2 or more areas that require exploration, or even no boss at all, surprisingly. Once the player completes the last chapter of the story for the individual they originally selected, they can change their party and move that specific character out of said party. In the first entry, all 8 characters had only 4 chapters to complete, and for the most part this remains the same with this sequel, although there are 3 characters that do have 5 total chapters. One thing with these stories in the sequel is that while their characters' respective single stories wrap up, it does seem like there are usually a few threads that hang unresolved if the player looks out for them, and this leads to some additional stories joining 2 of the 8 travelers, which allude to a final chapter in the game once those stories are completed as well. And this final chapter is just called Extra Stories, but I felt this was anything but extra, as it felt like a final solid end of the game with a clear conclusion for the story as a whole. And it also did a great job of tying everyone's stories together where applicable. This also was another nice change from the first entry, where there was a super secret boss fight that had an area which also had a massive text dump at the end of the game which tried to tie all of those 8 characters' stories together. It just kind of felt like how Chrono Cross was, explaining the whole story and backwave and everything like that at the last minute. And regarding the story, I'll just give a brief summary of the characters and my overall feelings for their stories themselves. But unlike my review for Live Alive, I'm going to keep this totally spoiler-free. I don't want to ruin anything on this. Again, there are 8 characters, starting with the hunter Ochette. She's the only non-human, as she's part of a tribe of beastlings. They're like half human, half dog people. Anyway, her story begins with like a choose your own Pokemon sort of option, though the choice the player makes does have big ramifications when Ochette's story finishes. And I felt like she was an overall likable character, and it was interesting to see her get along with NPCs as well as a lot of the travel banter during the normal progress in the game. Ochette's mission is for her to find the 3 spirits of the land to stop the Night of the Red Moon. And this event occurs when monsters appear, and they're related to the overall shadow, which ties into the Extra Stories final chapter. Next is the Apothecary Casti, and I selected her as my main character in the beginning of the game. And she's an amnesiac, not remembering her past, though she still keeps held in her heart a desire to help and heal others with her apothecarial skills. She gains allies by saving those with her medicine on her travels, though this comes to a head as she works to stop an enemy influenced by one of the individuals working behind the scenes that's revealed in the extra story's final chapter. Next up is the Thief Throne, and hers, as well as another characters I will touch upon shortly, were probably two of the darkest stories in the game. She's an assassin and a slave to a group called the Black Snakes, and she yearns for freedom from this gang. And to do so, she's got to find keys to the collar around her neck, which is a device meant to subjugate those in the gang. And admittedly, I felt the end of the story was a bit convoluted, as the mastermind behind everything in her stories was also one of the individuals behind some of the events that make up the extra story's final chapter. While there were some sexual innuendos in Octopath Traveler 1, thankfully the second entry didn't have many of these, though of course Throne's chapter was the exception to that. And this mastermind, the overall creep factor from him was really large, and it was really high on that effect too. Next up is the Scholar Oswald. His was the other of the two of the darkest stories, and his is also one of the 3 stories that has 5 chapters instead of 4. And prior to the start of his own story, Oswald worked with a colleague named Harvey to link mathematical equations with magic in search of something called the one true magic. And that actually goes beyond the main 6 elements of the game: fire, ice, lightning, wind, holy, and dark. Sporting a severe inferiority complex and jealous of Oswald's intelligence and skill, Harvey burns Oswald's house to the ground with his wife and daughter in it, then frames Oswald for their murders. Having spent 5 years in prison on a frozen island for a crime he did not commit, Oswald works to escape and get his revenge. And the first 2 chapters of his story are set in this particular prison and him making his escape. That part is kind of slow, but overall his story wrapped up really well. This main antagonist for Oswald's story, Harvey, also had a hand in manipulating events as mentioned in the extra story's final chapter. Next up is the merchant Partitio. His story starts in a Wild West type town where instead of a gold rush, they mine for silver. Partitio, his father, and the townsfolk they had settle in their town deal with poverty for some time, and Partitio vows to use his skills as a merchant to release others from the same fate he dealt with. I surprisingly enjoyed Partitio's story, as I liked the Wild West aesthetic in the beginning, and the final boss encounter in his story. Again, no spoilers. Partitio himself is also shown as one of the characters with the most positive mindset and personality out of the 8 main travelers. And this does get mentioned in the extra story's final chapter by a key character from Partitio's story. He also has the ability to buy a boat, which allows the player to explore the high seas. And this sort of boat exploration wasn't in the last entry, so I thought it was a fun, pleasant surprise. Next up is the dancer Agnia. She starts in a town that kind of resembled the Old South in the West, sans the overt racism. Agnia wishes to be a star through her dancing skills like her mother Kuani was. She travels across the world, gaining notoriety and renown until she participates in a dancing competition against Dulcinea, the biggest star in the world at this point. Her story also had 5 chapters and was probably one of the lightest of the stories with the least quote-unquote on the line, as it were. Next up is the cleric Temenos. His story begins at the Church of the Flame. It's like a Catholic-type religious institution. He works to solve the mystery of whom killed someone high up in his local church. Doing so leads him down a path revealing corruption with one of the militant wings of his church. His story arc plays heavily into a lot of the themes that the extra story's final chapter goes through, up to and including a surprise enemy the travelers must fight in this final chapter of the game, revealed as one of Temenos' former allies. And finally, the warrior Hikari. His story begins in a Japan-like country, except the land is a desert. Prince Hikari is a compassionate person who wishes to take the crown from his warmongering older brother, Doing so requires him to rally his former allies and friends who had separated after martial victories in the past. One of these friends, though, plays an extremely important role in the extra story's final chapter. So does the mysterious, shadowy nature of Hikari himself as revealed during his own story's chapters. I also thoroughly enjoyed Hikari's story, as seeing Hikari being able to conquer his own darkness and walk into the light gave me sort of Final Fantasy IV Cecil becoming a paladin vibes. Finally, once all 8 characters have their own stories completed, as well as the 4 sets of dual stories, the option for the extra stories final chapter unlocks. And again, this is what Octopath Traveler 1 should have had, is it puts a great end to the overall story for the second entry. And again, not spoiling anything, though I have to mention one thing with the final boss fight. It occurs in a number of phases, and holy crap is it hard. That last phase, though, was amazing to behold, as it has all 8 travelers fighting the boss at once in a way. It was fantastic, and I loved this fight. Going back to the first Octopath Traveler game, I would have given that one a 10 out of 10, as that had fun gameplay and battle system, a great story, and an absolutely amazing soundtrack. And while playing like a classic JRPG, it sported a number of quality of life improvements that refined everything to a sharp, satisfying edge. Now take that first game, put it in the unique 19th century type setting, refine the story elements, and make them better, and that's what you've got with this sequel. And yeah, there were a couple glitches, that one crash I'd mentioned, and some voice quality issues. I can't say for sure if that was indicative to my experience on the Switch or the game overall. Regardless, with how well this game was, I would definitely give it a 10 out of 10. This is another fantastic entry by Team Asano, and it's a big win for classic JRPG fans such as myself and others. Now, have you ever heard of Octopath Traveler 2 or had played the first entry at all? Let me know in the comments section below. Please like, subscribe, and ring that bell for more notifications. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.